Night had fallen over the small town of Redwood Ridge, but instead of the expected tranquility, a raging storm descended upon the land. The wind howled with uncontrollable fury, whipping through the trees and making the streetlights sway as if they were about to collapse. The rain wasn't just falling, it was crashing down from the sky in dense torrents, turning the streets into a maze of shifting shadows and distorted reflections. Atop the highest hill in town, St. Helena Hospital stood like a beacon in the darkness, its cold lights flickering against the rain-slicked glass. Inside, the emergency room was a whirlwind of movement. Doctors and nurses rushed between patients, drivers who had lost control in the storm, elderly people weakened by the cold, children terrified by the relentless crash of thunder. The sharp scent of antiseptic mixed with the beeping of medical machines and the anxious murmur of conversations. But outside, something different was happening. Beyond the parking lot, something moved in the darkness. Something huge. A heavy shadow slid between the twisted trees, crossing the road in eerie silence. Lightning split the sky, illuminating, for the briefest moment, a massive figure stumbling forward. The wind carried a thick, metallic scent, the unmistakable smell of blood. Then, without warning, the hospital's automatic doors burst open. A blast of icy wind rushed into the reception area, sending papers flying, knocking over clipboards, and making the ceiling lights sway. For a moment, every head turned toward the entrance, expecting to see nothing but the storm's endless black void. But what they saw was far worse. A colossal grizzly bear stepped through the doorway, its heavy, dragging footsteps echoing against the sterile white tiles. Its body was drenched in rain and streaked with mud and blood, deep wounds gaping along its sides. Its chest heaved, each breath a visible struggle. The hospital fell into absolute silence. For a heartbeat, there was no storm. No movement. Nothing, except the wide, horrified eyes of every person in the room, locked onto the impossible sight before them. A massive bear, trembling and wounded, had just walked into the emergency room. And beneath its unsteady paws, something small was moving. Something still alive. The silence lasted only a moment. Then, chaos erupted. A scream echoed through the emergency room, followed by the sound of chairs scraping against the floor and objects crashing to the ground. Patients pressed themselves against the walls, nurses froze in place, their trembling hands still clutching charts and syringes. A doctor knocked over a tray of instruments, the metal clattering loudly against the cold tile. The security guard at the entrance reacted instinctively, his hand flying to his holster, his gun still secured, while he struggled to comprehend what the hell was happening. A massive grizzly bear, drenched in blood and mud, stood in the middle of the hospital reception. But it didn't roar. It didn't attack. It just stood there, chest heaving, paws trembling. Every breath was a colossal effort, as if merely staying upright was a battle it was losing. For a moment, everyone braced for the worst. The beast was cornered, and any wild animal, when cornered, attacks. But this one didn't. It staggered forward, its massive claws scraping against the polished floor, and then, its body collapsed. The impact made the ground tremble, and a pool of fresh blood spread rapidly around it. But no one had time to process the sight, because at that very instant, something small tumbled out from beneath its enormous paws. Something that shouldn't have been there. A nurse, still paralyzed with shock, widened her eyes as she realized what it was. A child. A little boy, no older than 4, drenched in rain, motionless. His small body looked impossibly fragile under the hospital's cold, sterile light. Pale skin. Lips tinged blue from the cold. Thin clothes soaked through, water dripping onto the white tiles beneath him. For a moment, no one moved. No one understood. The bear hadn't attacked anyone. The bear wasn't fleeing. The bear had brought the boy here. And now, it was dying. The hospital felt frozen in time. For a moment, no one knew what to do. The only sound was the rhythmic dripping of water from the child's soaked clothes, forming small puddles on the floor. The air was thick with the metallic scent of fresh blood, mingling with the sterile aroma of hospital corridors. Then, everything happened at once. Sarah Mitchell, still shaking, dropped to her knees beside the boy. Her trembling fingers brushed against his icy skin as she desperately searched for any sign of life. And then, she felt it. A faint heartbeat. He was alive. Her own heart raced. It was a miracle. A surge of movement swept through the hospital. Doctors and nurses rushed in like a wave, bringing a gurney, monitoring equipment, thermal blankets. The boy was carefully lifted off the cold floor, his heavy eyelids fluttered slightly, but his body remained limp. The hypothermia was severe. If they didn't act fast, he wouldn't make it. As the medical team raced down the corridor, pushing the boy toward the ICU, the bear remained exactly where it had fallen. Its massive chest rose and fell, slower with every second. David Carter, the security guard, still had his gun raised, his finger hovering near the trigger. But he didn't pull it. He couldn't. His instincts screamed that none of this made sense. No wild animal would do something like this. And yet, here it was. A grizzly bear, the most feared predator in the region, had carried a wounded child into a hospital. Whatever had happened in that forest, this wasn't an attack. Sarah, breathing unevenly, looked at the massive creature before her. The bear's eyes were open, but there was no rage in them. No aggression, no wildness. There was something else. Something deep. Something incomprehensible. Something almost human. What did it want? Why had it brought the boy here? With a long, heavy sigh, the bear closed its eyes. And the entire hospital held its breath. The storm still raged over the town as police cruisers tore down the deserted road, following the trail of something no one could explain. Sheriff Jack Coleman gripped the steering wheel tightly. His face was grim, eyes locked on the road, illuminated only by the car's headlights as the blizzard pounded against the windshield. The police radio crackled, an officer's voice thick with urgency. "We've got something here, Sheriff." That was all he needed to hear. As soon as the tires skidded over the soft snow, Coleman jumped out of the car, the biting wind slashing at his face like invisible blades. The officers were already there, their faces pale under the flashing blue and red lights of the sirens. And then, he saw it. The overturned car. The vehicle was almost buried in snow, its shattered windows reflecting the distant glare of the headlights. The hood was crushed, twisted as if it had collided with something before flipping over. A metal tomb, trapped by the merciless cold of the forest. Inside, a woman. Her body lay still. Eyes closed. The boy's mother. The sheriff closed his own eyes for a brief second, feeling the weight of the discovery settle on his shoulders. But that wasn't all. The footprints. There were footprints in the snow. Small ones, at first. Uneven. Fragile. A child's footprints. The boy had climbed out of the car. But then, next to the first trail, a second set appeared. And they were enormous. Grizzly bear tracks. Massive. Heavy. They circled the wreckage, forming an eerie ring around the crash site. The bear had been here. What happened next, no one knew. The scene was screaming with unanswered questions. If the bear had found the child, why didn't it kill him? Why did the footprints lead toward the road, not vanish into the forest? Coleman swallowed hard, his eyes following the trail etched in the snow. The only thing that made sense was unthinkable. The bear had taken the child. But not to kill him. Not to devour him. It had taken him to the hospital. The sheriff took a step back, trying to process it. The storm howled through the twisted branches of the trees, but he barely heard it. What had begun as a tragic case had become something much bigger. Something he couldn't explain. In the darkness of the forest, the impossible had happened. And now, he needed to find out why.
What do you think of this exciting journey? Incredible, isn't it? Before we continue, it's very important that you like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this.
At the hospital, 2 lives hung by a thread. The boy lay motionless, his small body sinking into the stark white sheets, wrapped in wires, monitors, and fragile hopes. The cold light of the room cast a pale glow over his face, his lips still tinged blue from the ice that had nearly claimed him forever. His body temperature was dangerously low. Every second was a battle against time. Doctors and nurses moved in silent urgency, the air thick with tension. The steady beeping of the monitors filled the space like an invisible clock, marking the thin line between life and death. Sarah Mitchell couldn't look away. She felt it. Something deep inside her knew. This boy had a story that had yet to be told. And on the other side of the hospital, a wild beast was fighting to keep breathing. The bear was still alive. Despite the wounds, despite the blood, despite the weight of death pressing down on him, he hadn't given in. His massive body lay sprawled across the hospital floor, surrounded by guards and hesitant doctors. His chest rose and fell in slow, strained movements, each breath an immense effort. The dried blood in his fur created a chaotic pattern of open scars and mud. This creature should have been dead. But he wasn't. And then came the question no one knew how to answer. What were they supposed to do with him? Inside the emergency room, the medical staff hesitated. He was a wild animal. A predator. A beast. Should he be treated as a patient? Or as a threat? Sheriff Coleman stood silent, arms crossed as he observed the bear from a distance. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on him. He knew the law. A wounded bear, left loose in a town, would never survive. But then, he remembered the trail in the snow. The footprints. The path that led directly to the hospital. The bear didn't run. He chose to come here. The storm pounded against the hospital windows, mirroring the indecision that hung in the air. Sarah took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked at the fallen beast. Then at the unconscious boy. 2 survivors of something no one understood. And then, in the middle of that heavy silence, the monitor beeped. Soft. Weak. But there. Sarah turned toward the bed, her breath catching in her throat. The boy moved. His eyes fluttered open. Small. Afraid. Exhausted. But alive. He blinked, the room's light reflecting in the damp shimmer of his gaze. His lips parted, trembling. And then, he whispered. Soft. Weak. Almost a breath. Mama Bear. The entire room fell silent. Sarah felt the blood freeze in her veins. The sheriff's brow furrowed. The doctors stopped. No one knew what it meant. No one knew what that boy had seen on that frozen night. But for the first time, they understood something unexplainable. The bear wasn't the villain in this story. He was the reason the boy was still alive. And now, they had to decide. Would they save the beast, or let it die? The sun had barely risen over the horizon when the first teams of journalists arrived. St. Helena Hospital, normally a place of quiet routine, had become the center of a storm even greater than the one that had devastated the town the night before. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered anxiously. Microphones stretched like spears toward the officials. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Was it true? Did a bear really carry a child to the hospital? Versions of the event spread like wildfire. Some claimed the beast had attacked, and by some miracle, the child had survived. Others spoke of an inexplicable bond between the boy and the animal. But there was one detail no one could ignore. The truth was recorded on the hospital's security cameras. And what everyone saw changed the story forever. Sheriff Jack Coleman stood in front of the screen, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The footage showed the impossible. On the grainy black and white screen, the bear emerged from the shadows, walking slowly through the storm. But it wasn't charging. It wasn't roaring. It wasn't attacking. It was holding something in its mouth with careful, deliberate gentleness. When it reached the hospital doors, it placed the small, fragile body of the child onto the cold tiles. And then, with its massive paw, nudged him softly. As if trying to wake him up. As if trying to say, "Now, you need to help him." And then, the bear collapsed. Inside the hospital, the boy woke up. His eyes were distant with exhaustion, his cheeks now warm, but his voice was still weak. He kept asking for the bear. There was something in his gaze. Something beyond the understanding of the adults in the room. He knew. Somehow, he knew that this creature was not a monster. That it was not a predator. It was a guardian. Sarah could see it in the boy's eyes. And at the same time, she felt the weight of a brutal truth. The town did not see it the same way. Outside, the crowd was growing. Authorities were debating. Opinions were divided. And a decision had to be made. The law was clear. A bear that entered a town was a risk. And by law, it had to be eliminated. But this was not just any bear. And now, his fate lay in the hands of the very humans he had chosen to trust. A thin morning mist hovered over the dirt road leading to the reserve. The air still carried traces of the storm that had ravaged the town days before, but now, there was something different in the wind. Something less fierce. Something inevitable. The truck carrying the grizzly bear moved forward slowly, flanked by police vehicles. Inside the steel cage, the animal remained still, its eyes gazing beyond the bars, as if it already knew this would be its final moment here. The decision had been made. The hospital and the authorities had given in to public pressure, and the bear would not be put down. But it also could never roam freely again. Its fate was sealed. The forest. A new home. A new exile. When they arrived at the reserve, the sky seemed too gray for a farewell. A crowd was already waiting. Onlookers, journalists, children with wide, wondering eyes. And among them, the boy. His small fingers clutched the teddy bear he had received at the hospital, holding it with the same intensity he had once held the bear's massive paw on the night it saved his life. Sarah stood beside him, her hands gently resting on his shoulders, feeling the tension in his little body as he watched the scene unfold. The moment had come. One of the rangers unlocked the cage with a metallic clank. The door swung open slowly. The world held its breath. The bear hesitated. Its muscles were stronger now. Its wounds had healed. But it didn't run. It didn't turn away immediately. It looked at the hospital one last time. And then, it saw. The boy's eyes met its own. For a moment, time stood still. There was no storm. There was no fear. Only the inexplicable truth between them. Something that neither the adults nor the town would ever fully understand. The bear blinked slowly, as if recognizing the boy one last time. And then, it turned away. Step by step, it walked toward the forest. No rush. No hesitation. No looking back. The darkness of the trees swallowed it whole. And then, it was gone. No one in the crowd knew what to say. But the boy did. Because sometimes, goodbyes don't need words. And sometimes, love doesn't need explanation. Time passed. The streets of the town returned to their quiet routine, and St. Helena Hospital continued receiving patients who came and went, just as always. But something had changed. That stormy night was not forgotten. And it never could be. It started in a subtle way. The week after the bear's release, a child left a small teddy bear in the hospital lobby. It was placed there without explanation, right beside the reception desk. The next day, another one appeared. And then another. And another. Until, within weeks, an entire row of plush bears sat lined up on the counter. Everyone knew what it meant. A tribute to the silent guardian. The bear who emerged on the darkest night, carrying the weight of the forest and the warmth of protection. The boy never saw his savior again. But he never forgot him. In his home, in the corner of his bed, the same teddy bear he held on the day of their farewell remained there, always within reach of his small hands. And every night, before closing his eyes, he whispered the same words. "Mama Bear, I will never forget you." And from somewhere, beyond the trees, the wind howled softly in response. Like an echo. Like a promise. Like a guardian who never truly left. Some stories defy logic. They shatter what we think we know about the world and remind us of something greater, something we feel but cannot explain. On that stormy night, a grizzly bear, a creature of the wild, did the unthinkable. He didn't attack. He didn't run. He didn't abandon. He chose to save. And as he carried that fragile child between his teeth, crossing the cold and the darkness, he proved that instinct is not always just about survival. Sometimes, it's something more. An invisible bond between lives so different, yet connected by the same unspoken desire, to protect, to care, and to endure. The bear is gone, but his story remains. Because some encounters are not mere coincidence. And some heroes appear in the most unexpected forms. Some wear capes. Others bear claws and the scars of the wilderness. But they all leave us with the same undeniable truth. True heroism has no face. It has a heart.
What did you think of this story? If you liked it, like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more exciting stories like this one.